All right, good afternoon, everyone. I believe we have quite a few people dialing in. Might wait a little bit longer. Hope you're all doing well and not going crazy staying at home for so long. I know I'm personally sick of my apartment, but surviving. I see some familiar faces around here, which is great. All right. I think for the purposes of this exercise, we're just going to probably give it about 2 minutes before we go into it. And then I'll walk you through the agenda today. Just to let you know, you're happy to leave your videos on. It's up to you. Just mute your microphones for now. The main speakers today, I believe there is a video of them. You want to give us a wave? You've got Matt Chilsolm. He's the COO of Arc Spaces. And we have Claude Ducharme. Claude has an extensive career in technology, and as CTO roles, is also a founder of various startups as well. So there's definitely a wide range of perspectives that we can provide in this regard, specifically around BCP. All right, look, I think just in the interest of time, we can actually start the webinar as is. So to talk about today's agenda, basically, if you haven't read the report, we're going to be running through some of the key aspects of the report that Quinlan Associates released just last week. And that was really looking at the, I guess, the relevance of BCP in today's age, especially given the impact of COVID-19 and how it's changing business practices for companies both large and small of pretty much every single industry. So for today's topics we're going to cover, we're basically going to start with an overview of the economic impact of COVID-19, understanding what actually BCP is, the importance of an effective BCP. So in particular, the emphasis on BCP in the digital age, many of us being thrown into the digital depths at the moment. And unless we're online and digitally engaged, it becomes quite difficult to run the business. And as part of that, we'll also look at the whole concept of the future of work. What is the outlook for basically corporate practices and employment? And then beyond that, I guess looking at the core elements of what constitutes a robust BCP strategy. So I think many companies have elements of BCP coordinated or integrated in their plans, but in terms of a strategy, we feel there is much more that can be done. And then we'll finalize it with some quick business tips for COVID-19. I think many businesses are struggling with similar problems, so we'll go through that. Format of this, about 45 minutes for the actual presentation. I do want to leave about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you do have questions, even throughout the webinar, please feel free to put them on the public chat group and we'll do our best to address them as we move along. So our speakers for today, I think we'll go through and allow each of them to introduce themselves. I'll start. So for those of you who aren't aware, my name is Benjamin Quinlan. I am the CEO and managing partner of Quinlan Associates, and we are a strategy consulting firm specializing in primarily financial services. I also sit on the board of the FinTech Association of Hong Kong, and my career used to be in investment banking and strategy consulting. We cover a lot of different topics in the financial services space and broader topics within strategy as a whole. But given what's been happening over the past few weeks and months, BCP has definitely been a topic of hot and utmost priority for many businesses around the world. We also have Matthew Chilsolm and Claude Ducharme on the call. Matt and Claude, would you like to introduce yourselves just to the group and explain a bit more about your backgrounds, maybe starting with Matt?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Benjamin. So Matthew Chilsolm is my name. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Arc Spaces. We are a real estate development investment firm. We run flexible workplace operations throughout Asia. My background is in commercial real estate, originally in real estate valuation and commercial leasing, where I've spent a lot of time in China and in Asia Pacific markets. I worked for a company called CB Richard Ellis for some time, leading their landlord consultancy division. So we spent a lot of time looking at how workplace strategy, the design of office spaces drives productivity, and now particularly looking at how we can take additional factors like technology and programming to drive productivity. I guess particularly relevant given today's conversation as to how we see the future of the workplace. So thanks for having me, Benjamin and Quinlan Associates.
Mute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Okay, so do you want to introduce a bit more about yourself and your background, just for the people who've dialed into this call?
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally a software developer. I worked more than 15 years in IT, 2 in video surveillance, doing CCTV, then did 10 years in investment banking on the buy side and sell side. After that, I started my company, Gobi Bike. So entrepreneurship, starting with 2 people, very different size, different challenges. And after that, I worked at Prive, currently doing an MBA. So I've seen many company size, different stakes for the BCP, but I think banks are taking it very seriously. And this is where I've taken the most learning and then applied that in the smaller companies. So at Prive, for example, we were dealing with private banks and they had similar standard to what I was used to in SocGen. So this is what I'm going to share today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claude. I've got a new mic, so I'm just testing. You can hear me okay, everyone? Okay, great.
Yep.
All right, so without further ado, let's just kick off the webinar. Again, if you have questions, remember, just type them in and we'll endeavor to address them as we go along. And if there's no questions throughout the presentation, we'll answer most of them at the end. And feel free to articulate which speaker you would like to address your specific response if needed. All right, so let's go through the lovely outlook for the world economy under COVID-19. So at Quinlan Associates, we have our perspectives around what COVID-19 is going to really mean for global economic outlook. So if you look at where we are right now, worldwide GDP as at the end of 2019 stood at about 86 trillion US dollars. And I think there's widespread consensus, even if you speak to economists right through the banks, that a recession is on the cards. But the question right now is, what does the recession look like? Is it a V-shaped recovery? Is it a U-shaped recovery? Or is it an L-shaped recovery? And obviously, depending on which scenarios you're going to enter, that really fundamentally changes the dynamics about what the overall environment will look like. So let's just take stock of what's going on around the world. Stock markets, I think for any of you that were in the market a few months ago, while you've seen, I guess, valuations come back over the past 2 weeks, I would say, if not 3 weeks, there has been a substantial dip in overall indexes, regardless of which country you are in around the world. Most of the indexes are off about 20–25% from their previous highs, if not slightly more. And I think investors are now extremely nervous around what is going to happen and what the outlook is, just because we've now, I think as of today, exceeded about 1.5 million infections worldwide. The United States is approaching about 450,000. So when you look at those scenarios, I think there has been a major crisis of confidence because the West, in terms of the infection rates, has just faced the big brunt of it, countries like Italy and Spain, and obviously with the United States kicking off now. So if you look at the various scenarios we lay out, I guess it's up to each individual person to work out what the likelihood of these scenarios is. I mean, from our perspective, a best case scenario, so you can see a 2021 bull case, and you can tell by the fact that we wrote 2021 is we consider this more of a U or an L-shaped recovery than a V-shape. So this is basically a plateau in infections. I think there's some early signs of infections petering out as summer approaches, as travel bans and social distancing kicks in, and then hopes of obviously a new vaccine. But from our perspective, I guess our base case view is yes, plateau in infections more in the east, but ongoing, continuing rising infections in Europe and a spike in the US. And obviously we wrote this about 2 weeks ago, so I think we were quite spot on with that. And no immediate vaccine in sight. I mean, I'm not in the medical science field myself, but I would not be too optimistic about the speed at which a vaccine can hit the market. I think there's a lot of hurdles that it needs to go through. And obviously, based on our experience with other coronaviruses, not exactly the most optimistic outlook right now. Bear case scenarios, obviously blowout in infections in the West as governments struggle to enforce prolonged lockdowns. And then a kind of worst case scenario is really an exponential wave of infections as the virus mutates, and a second wave blows out as the lockdown laws come off. I think Wuhan, just as of midnight, celebrated the lockdown laws being relaxed. And you've seen obviously a massive exodus of people outside of Wuhan. I think it was about 55,000 just today. And obviously, fingers crossed that everyone is free from infection, but I think it really creates a bit of a worry out there around what that means for people getting back to normal life. You've even seen a lot of interesting videos around places like Beijing with the shopping malls opening again. They're completely empty. So even despite the fact that people now have the capacity to move, there is still quite a lot of fear and caution being exercised by people. And really, what is this doing to financial markets? You're seeing, obviously, widespread government bailout packages occurring. And I think this is on the back of, you can see the third column, what's happening in the employment space. I think every country around the world is registering a rise in both in their nominal unemployment. I think the US, when we wrote this report, it was the weekly job claims of about 3.3 million, which was 12x its highest previous weekly claim number in, I think, since the Great Depression. That's how long it's been. And then 1 week later, that spiked to 6.6 million for that week. So you're looking at about 10 million new unemployed claims within the span of just a fortnight. So the numbers are quite scary. And from our view, I think what we need to bear in mind is that there's a lot of stimulus packages being provided by governments to subsidize or cover costs of wages. But what people are really starting to understand now is there's actually a really, I guess, a bit of a pinch when it comes to spillover effects into other industries. This is really a crisis of confidence, right? And I think people are fundamentally reining in their spending. You have a look at generally what this means for unemployment. I mean, I was just thinking about it as a strategy consultant. You go to restaurants and bars and low-skilled labor jobs. Even if the government is covering, 70, 75%, 80% of the salaries for people that are kept on, there is no business for a lot of these places, zero. And I know a lot of people that are going out of business right now. The other thing is, I guess, especially among low-skilled labor, is there a need to keep them on? Or can you, when the lockdowns ease up, easily hire and replace these employees? And I think the answer is leaning much more towards the left or the latter than the former. So it's spelling quite an interesting scenario for that part of the workforce. And especially as we've come into the digital age, the rise of what we call the gig economy, a lot of contractors and independent consultants doing their own thing. And I can assure you that most of the people I'm speaking to who are operating in that space, their revenue has dried up, be it a fitness coach, a personal trainer, a life coach, you name it. I mean, so many people are now running into problems, even in the developer space. It literally got depressing when someone said, in my LinkedIn, please help me get out of this crisis, right? And that's literally the plea for help around work. So I think it's spelling a bit of a negative outlook, and we don't want to be so negative about it. But I think the other fact and the reason why we call this a bit more of a U-shaped recovery is really around the emphasis on social backlash. I think for those of you who have been in Hong Kong, you can see how a few thousand hardcore protesters can take to the streets and cripple a city into recession. I think if you look at it from the context of how many millions, tens of millions of people are going to be out of work globally, if there is a spike in civil unrest that comes off the back of this, then it doesn't matter about the financial subsidies that come into place. I think there is going to be a potential huge risk of moving into very dangerous territory around social and political unrest, and obviously weighing on the infrastructure, both healthcare and social security of governments worldwide. So we hope our forecasts aren't necessarily correct. It's one of the things as a consultant where we actually hope we're wrong, but our target is for a 4% GDP decline between 2020 to 21, with a best case of a 1% drop. If we enter obviously Great Depression territory, which is a 15% worst case scenario, then that's not looking good. We don't think that will happen, obviously, because of the scale of government intervention. But I guess the one thing we want to draw out here is when GFC happened, most economies around the world were not operating at near zero interest rates. There is very little room to move when it comes to monetary policy with Western economies. As well as that, you look at central banks, they are just printing money left, right, and center. And I think when you've got governments that are broke and interest rates that are at or near zero, from a policy response perspective, you're running out of ammunition to tackle these kind of crises. And obviously that, gives rise to other issues around, is this going to drive the next wave of hyperinflation? So anyway, not to be gone into in this, but I think it's setting a scene for a lovely, non-depressing conversation around the outlook for BCP. So anyway, what's happened? BCP has come front and center. So for those of you who don't know what BCP is, and it's your first primer on the topic, it's basically a business continuity plan, right? So it outlines the procedures and systems that need to be put in place by an organization to prevent and ultimately recover from potential threats to the business. And I think a lot of companies these days don't think holistically around what are the threats that our business could face. And a lot of us face very similar threats, depending on where you live. Let's say you live in an earthquake-prone zone, as we saw with the Fukushima disaster. So earthquakes, storm damages, viral outbreaks. Obviously, we're all in the midst of COVID-19. And that's created these mass work from home arrangements and a migration to online communication channels such as Zoom, as we're doing right now. So these are more naturally occurring phenomena. Then you've got on the other end of the spectrum what we call behaviorally induced, right? So these are things like employee theft, cyber attacks, or just basic human error. So cyber attacks in particular are very interesting because with a growing share of consumer activity and corporate workflow moving online, these cyber attacks are remaining a constant threat. So cyber resilience is actually becoming of utmost importance. And then of course you have, I guess, what we call incidents that kind of straddle both naturally or behavioral induced causes. So these can be things like system outages, it can be a power grid failure, maybe someone steps on a power line in your office building or accidentally cuts it. Mechanical failure, so the machine could be faulty or you could have assembled it incorrectly. A fire, obviously the Australian bushfires that you've seen, or it could be arson. So overall, there's a whole bunch of risks that companies need to consider. Some of them far more remote, some of them far more close to home. But overall, the core focus of a BCP is basically to manage the events that threaten the ability of a business to continue its normal operations, right? So BCP is designed to ensure business as usual. So why is it important, right? A lot of people, when it comes to BCP, relegate their BCP activities to what you'd call the annual fire drill, as well as some basic insurance coverage. I think that's what most companies do when it comes to their, business continuity protocols. But overall, a lot of businesses face huge or significant risks that can come about as a result of not having effective continuity management in place. And we talk about these from the perspective of what we call internal risks and external. So internal being financial, operational, and employee. So the impact directly to these components of your business. So financial, you could have a direct impact to P&L. You could lose revenues, or you could ramp up costs if you don't have a contingency plan in place. So for example, a machine breaks down, you don't have an alternative supplier, you have to go direct to someone else, and the cost is through the roof, right? Operationally, so overall, you could have disruptions to your short-term operations, as we all have had, and then some broader disruptions around the whole long-term strategy for your business. So imagine restaurants right now. How do you operate a restaurant? Do you need to move to digital channels? Is Deliveroo and Uber Eats the way, right? Employees, so even threats to health, safety, damage to staff morale, impact to workplace productivity. This cannot be underestimated in terms of what's happening right now. A lot of companies are very concerned about their staff. I've personally shut down my office since Chinese New Year. I want to burn my apartment down, but I know I can't. So the way we're going, I think from a physical safety perspective, we're trying our very best to keep our distance and socially distance. But again, that weighs hugely on staff morale. I mean, as a boss, I'm doing my very best to ensure that people are engaged, that they don't feel isolated. For those of you who live in Hong Kong, you can understand how lovely and large our apartments are here. So being holed up in Hong Kong is a very different proposition to some other places in the world. And obviously that morale impacts workplace productivity too. And then you've got obviously external factors. So how can your risks impact your customers, your suppliers, your regulators, or even your brand, right? So you could cease your services, right? You could stop delivering. You could drive dissatisfaction with your customers. Supply chains could be impacted, as you're seeing right now with COVID-19, right? So hugely unfavorable contract terms, or you could have even a complete loss of suppliers. So, for example, freight costs have gone through the roof for a lot of companies to get things delivered, right? And even then, a lot of things can't be delivered because international trade is basically on lockdown. Regulatory perspective. So other industries like financial services, or you look at pharma, there are more regulatory obligations, right, associated with them. A lot of us may not fall within that remit or within that space. But if you do, you could face some very severe fines or other non-financial penalties if you don't comply. And then finally, I think what people miss is really around brand, right? It's the reputational damage associated with what we call adverse media coverage, or in this day and age, viral backlash on social media. And I'll give you an example right now. So for those of you, I'm sure that Pure doesn't want me using its logo for this purpose, but I can only report facts as facts are, right? So for those of you who live in Hong Kong, I am a patron of Pure Fitness, right? Pure Fitness is a fitness chain franchise that has, I don't know how many gyms around the city, but quite a lot. They're quite a large provider with thousands of members. And in mid-March, actually, about a month ago, a patron of Pure tested positive for COVID-19, right? And the company actually chose to continue operating its gym facilities as usual, and it didn't immediately notify its members, right? So there was actually a massive public backlash. Everyone was taken to social media, Facebook, and when that infection became public, there was a huge pushback from the general public, especially members, basically saying, why didn't you close your gyms earlier to be disinfected, and so on. So the pushback wasn't good. And I think when you look at it from a BCP perspective, right? So what could Pure have done? So they chose not to really proactively address this, communicate it, and make a very quick reaction to it, which could have impacted their business. So they could have rapidly informed everyone that attended the gyms on the day that that patron was there, because they digitally sign in every single person that goes to the gym that day. They know who shares the same trainer. And I think some of these actions were taken from a remedial perspective after, but it wasn't taken proactively before, right? So what happens is companies suffered a big reputational backlash, forced them to close all their facilities for at least 2 weeks. I mean, now everyone's in the same boat, but you know, did they need to necessarily do this? offer partial membership refunds, hire an external team to disinfect the premises, cost, reputational impact. Could you have made this less burdensome on your business had you approached it the right way? So obviously short-term financial impact from extended gym closures, but long-term impact as well from this whole negative PR. Quite frankly, personally, I was infuriated because obviously I'm a patron of Pure, and just to know that I could have received a phone call saying, you know, be aware, this is what happened on these days, you were there that day or you weren't, or so on. It's, you know, it's basic BCP in our view that could have been done, right? And then I will pass it over to Claude, and he is going to walk through some examples about BCP applications in examples actually more in the digital age. So Claude, do you want to run through some of these?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, a little bit of concrete examples on the IT side. Let's say you have a small company, 15 people. You're doing the payroll internally, and the accountant save the Excel spreadsheet to do the payroll on her laptop. You arrive on Monday at the office and the building is closed because it's being infected, or could be a flood that screwed up all the computers. So how could you have handled this differently? It's possible to use Office 365. It's possible to use Google Docs or Dropbox. There are many solutions there. I think what's important is to sit down with the people and make sure that you have a plan for something going wrong, so you're not catched by surprise. You can work online on all these documents. It doesn't have to be locally, but you need to see with the employees what is possible. The other case is the source code at GoBeBike. So when I started my company in 2017, we bought a prototype and then we built on with internal developers the platform to expand the functionalities. I was really worried about this code leaking to competition or even the public, because it's intellectual property. But then when I analyzed how much it would cost me to protect it, 10,000-20,000 USD, and the time, energy it would take me, I measure the pros and cons, and then at the end, the code is valuable, but not as much as the relation we have with our clients and the supply chain and the bikes that are on the street. So that was our key differentiator. So the code, I relaxed it. I allowed the software developers to use their own laptops. And then I focused my energy on 3 other things. Securing the data from customers, so there's no personal information leakage. Securing the connection between the mobile apps and the server to make sure that there is no tampering. And making sure the source code is at all times saved on a server remotely. In that case, we use GitHub, but in the case of somebody's getting his laptop stolen or it breaks down, we can continue our business where we left off. So that was the critical areas I wanted to focus. The source code had value, but it was not leading to the survival of the company if it was lost. And then the other example will be a little bit more succinct. Let's say you have servers on premises running to save costs in your office, and you want a plan in case something goes wrong. It's possible to put it on the cloud, either on the cloud and on premises, spread the load, or to have the cloud instance that is shut down. So it's there, it's saved, it's ready to go, but it's not on. If there's something happening to your office and there's no one to push the reboot button, or there is a water leak, then you can ask your engineers to start it on the cloud, and the traffic will be rerouted to the cloud. So there's cost in implementing this solution, but there is no running cost until you hit the issue. Next slide. Next one. Yes, yeah. So as mentioned, the areas of focus should be the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is part of the security and risk management. So confidentiality, making sure there's no personal, cannot hear you, unmute. I could not hear you. Okay. Confidentiality, make sure that there is no personal data leakage. So the database at GoBeBag, for example. Integrity, making sure that the data you have is not getting tampered by a third party or employees. That's protecting the database and the connection between the apps and the server. Could be deleting emails, accounts, or sniffing the traffic and have a middleman attacked. And the availability is the third case. If your server goes down, is there another server able to take the service charge and then reroute the users somewhere else? So if you're in the fintech world, you probably dealt with HKMA and MAS. They are the money authorities of Hong Kong and Singapore. There are also securities commissions that are overseeing what you can do and cannot do. And during a BCP, it's important to have the same level of standards. Otherwise, you might get issues with these guys. If you want to go a little bit deeper, there are certifications you can seek, like ISO 27001 and SOC. These are basically checklists, and they will help you to put policies in place to think about all the options. So somebody asked me, how can we do things in a cheap way? You don't always need to have IT systems to handle all this security, all this availability, confidentiality. You start with policies. So you put policies in place and standard operating procedures to make sure that people know what they can do and cannot do. That it will be structured when there's a problem. So it's not the first time and going with trial and error. And these are going to define the strength you have and your reaction time. So talking about reaction time, above the, well, there's the law, the standards and regulation, but you also have clients and you might have a signed contract with service level agreement with them. What's important is to make sure that if the server goes down, the service, you're not able to offer your service anymore, you're going to recover quickly. So this is the RTO, the recovery time objective. Let's say it will be 15 minutes from the cut. And the RPO is the recovery point objective. So let's say you have a server on premises, there's a flood, your last backup on the cloud was at midnight and you discover the problem at 8 a.m., you're losing effectively 8 hours of potential transactions. So this is the point in time. So you can do backups more frequently, or you can agree with the clients that there might be some things lost and they are fine with it. Next slide. So one of my idol is this guy, Werner Vogels, the CTO and VP of Amazon and AWS. In most conferences is going to say everything fails all the time, and is very well placed to know it because he's managing millions of servers. So how do they tackle this? They practice all the time. They have standard operating procedures and they try to automate things. So it's very important to communicate internally on what are these consequences of having a downtime. Publish them on SharePoint or your wiki. Go to the stakeholders and ask them hard questions. Okay, what if this fails and this fails? And it's sad to say, but usually bad news comes in a bunch. So prepare to brace for the worst case scenario. And rehearse. On the weekend when there's no users or have a different environment, crash the system, see how you can recover, do it quarterly, yearly, or when there's a major change. And then to incentivize people to work on these and be serious, you can even plan this on the OKRs. Say, okay, We're going to practice quarterly. It's going to take maximum 1 hour, and then we're going to practice A, B, C. So talking about the pure communication, to lead to my last point, you can write these templates in advance. You can extract mailing lists just in case something happens and you're ready to send this communication. You can have interns working on this. And as an example, recently Zoom was put on the spot for some security flaws. Actually, they are not big flaws. They exist in many other systems, but when it got out, there was this wave of misinformation. So what the CEO did very quickly was a message to the users, said, okay, we took action. We acknowledge that we had few issues. So we did A, B, C, and it's now on the latest release. And in the coming weeks and months, we're going to work on these next flaws to address your concerns. So very transparent. I think these days people are very stressed. So it's best to avoid surprises and be clear and upfront on the communication. Okay.
Thank you, Claude. Very good. All right. Well, we're going to have to just rejig a bit of the order, but that's fine. So obviously, Claude sharing some very useful perspectives on BCP within the context of digital enablement. I think what I want to do is obviously go back right now to just thinking about BCP as a whole, because I think if you want to do this exercise properly as an organization, you really need to think through the constituent parts or pillars of what makes for a good BCP strategy. And like any good strategy, basically it requires very solid design, meticulous implementation, and that includes testing and communication, and also regular evaluation of your BCP. So I think first of all, we start with design, right? So the whole idea is you identify the threats, the resultant impact on the business across all your key risk categories that are relevant to you, and then the steps that you need to put in place to respond and ultimately recover. Right? Implementation is all about appropriate testing, training, communication processes to make sure that whatever you lay out in your design and in your strategy can be delivered. Evaluation, there's no point in doing a design and implementation if you don't evaluate your processes regularly to ensure your protocols actually make sense. And that also includes documenting that process, because it's very important that you can go back and reference what you've done and the success of that against something that is genuinely documented. Governance and oversights are always very important to ensure that the right stakeholders and groups are driving the efforts within your organization. And the governance and oversight point actually changes to quite a big degree depending on how large you are. A lot of big organizations will have BCP specialists, so people obviously whose one and only job is to run this kind of a process. But within small organizations, most don't really have any kind of designated person in place. So it tends to be this double hat of perhaps a COO, a CFO, different stakeholders, or a functional unit of different people across the organization to own various parts of that BCP process. So it could be what you call a BCP task force. The whole purpose of that is to create a group with the relevant skills and coverage across the organization. And you also need the right monitoring from senior management. And then we also mentioned here robust reporting tools. I say that because I've been in so many organizations where there were BCP reports that were just stacks and stacks of paper with sense checks of what's going on. And I can assure you, as a management team, no one reads it, no one cares. You have to be able to do your reporting in such a way that BCP and the elements that are most important to management can be communicated clearly. That involves obviously identifying the right KPIs, metrics, and visualizing the data as opposed to just having an Excel sheet checklist of things that people might need to look into, right? And then finally, last but not least, it's really the emphasis on culture. I think in everything that we do in strategy as a firm, we really stress the importance of mindset change. You can go through with any exercise and tell a client or advise a client what to do. or even do that internal process yourself. But unless you have the right kind of ownership and accountability mindset around BCP strategy, then your organizational DNA really doesn't evolve, right? I mean, like the most basic example is that when we look at the importance of culture, we all talk about digital innovation, digital transformation. How many times do you realize you're using applications, but your mindset may not be evolved in such a way, or certain colleagues, or maybe your bosses who are of a different generation that aren't engaged with the same chat tools or interfaces or whatever. So you end up doing things in a much more mechanical way or a manual way, using Excel spreadsheets, whatever it might be, or using Word documents. This happens all the time because, you know, habits are very hard to break. So the cultural aspect around BCP is obviously very important. Now, if we go through, I guess, the core elements of this, some of these, we can look at the concept of design, right? BCP design is probably it's the first step, and it's obviously the most important thing to make sure that everything that comes thereafter is done correctly. But if you're looking at how to design a BCP framework, we basically break it down into 4 key steps. So the first one is really threat identification. So you remember before I was talking about different threats like cyber, theft, earthquakes, a viral outbreak. So you really need to go through and identify the threats that face your business and their likelihood of occurrence. And obviously different companies, different industries, different geographies, different customer focus will face different threats. I think the one thing that is quite unique is COVID-19 applies to everyone, but you can obviously see that certain industries are bearing more of a brunt of this compared to others. So if you look at restaurants, food and beverage, tourism, you know, airlines, hospitality, all getting decimated because of what's going on in the current environment. So threat identification, very important. Then you need to assess the risks, right? So assess the risks is basically how much impact or what's the severity that these risks are likely to have on our business. I think no one could have guessed just how severe the impact of COVID-19 would be in terms of global commerce and economic activity. But I think we're all very aware and feeling the brunt of it now. And when you go through this exercise, you really finally, you know, venture into this whole, what we call business impact analysis, is BIA, right? And part of that is working with the stakeholders in the organization to model out and think very clearly the cost-benefit analysis associated with things going wrong and not having the right procedures in place to address them, or potentially having the right procedures and understanding what kind of mitigation that could provide to that particular risk, which funnels into, I guess, what you see as the risk procedures, right? So an important thing with BCP is it's mapping out procedures from our view 3 overarching perspectives. So one is prevention procedures and mitigation. Secondly is response, and then third is recovery. So prevention, like I'll give you an example. A prevention procedure is, do you create an alternative list of suppliers which you can go to in the event that one of your suppliers might go out of business, right? So you're basically trying to mitigate the impact of a potential risk occurring. Response, obviously this is in relation to what a lot of people are doing when it comes to the current COVID-19 situation in terms of working from home, in terms of making sure that you're onto digital platforms, or, you know, a lot of companies in Hong Kong, especially larger ones, have instituted rotational staff arrangements where, you know, 50% of staff might come in for 1 week and the other 50% come in for another week. And that's to ring fence, obviously, a possible outbreak or infection within a certain cluster of people. The larger the organization, the more fragmented it is, the more you can conduct that exercise and compartmentalize different businesses in more granular ways. But this is one way that it happens. And obviously, if organizations are very small, it's quite hard to institute those kind of arrangements, but they can be done. And then finally, recovery. Really, how do you get back on your feet, right? let's hope and let's pray, and it's going to happen. This situation will end, right? It will ultimately end. So what's the path to recovery? What's the path to returning business to normalcy? And as you can see, this whole Zoom approach, who knows if this is going to end up being the new norm? I mean, a lot of people are getting used to it. Mind you, I think many people also don't know when to mute their microphone or unmute their microphone, but it's obviously creating a lot of fun amusement in many of the calls that we're doing these days. But this might end up being a much larger part of the way that we just work. And obviously, Matt, you know, I don't know if you have any initial perspectives on this in terms of the future of work or the way that we operate, but you know, given the emphasis of your role and what you do, would be great to hear some of your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I was on a similar roundtable earlier this week where we were talking to global real estate experts, consultants, including investment trusts, occupiers, landlords, etc. And one of the outcomes of that conversation was the role of COVID in accelerating the inevitable with regards to the adoption of online collaborative tools and cloud computing. And yeah, I think it's a fascinating opportunity for the industry, for all industries, mine as well as our customers, in that with the advent of 5G technology too, I think it's opportune timing. And we realize that the bandwidth and the technology is now there to act as this facilitator, where we are now more connected but more mobile than ever before. So remote working for many people will actually turn out to be advantageous when you consider that 60%, typically 60+% of a company's operating expenditure is comprised of rental and payroll. So the potential savings that can be captured by embracing the change that's happening now, and that new normal includes components of flexible workplace as well as technology, I think is a good thing. But it really is case by case. I think too that we realize with such unprecedented events that there's no silver bullet, as I'm sure you know in the consulting field, right? We can make generalizations to a certain degree, but no one really knows where we're headed, and it's a little bit too early to say yet. So, but I'd say overall we are optimistic about the role of technology in driving productivity remotely.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. This has changed the nature of the way that we work. I mean, 2 months of being away from my team and not having social contact is very odd. As consultants, obviously, you can see our slides, we love drawing crap, right? We love it. We love putting things in diagrams and structuring our thought process so people can see how we think through problems. And without our magic whiteboard marker and a whiteboard, it's quite hard to articulate our thinking just through the use of our words. But it has created a very unique dynamic in the way that I interact with my team personally. We have daily calls now on Zoom. They're still reluctant to use their video, so I guess it's just me speaking to myself, but a lot of the time that's fine. But I find generally, even when I see your faces here, there's a very cool level of engagement when you start to see people online, and it makes you feel like you're not necessarily as remote. This just feels like I'm FaceTiming my parents, but they're not as annoying in terms of this group. So, but overall, I generally see, an interesting story that I brought out as one of my consultants after working from home for about a month said, just, please open the office. I want to go back to work. So it was just the flexibility around where you can work. And I agree, Matthew, if you as this situation unfolds, and it will continue to obviously stay with us for months to come, I think the few week forecasts around lockdowns or work from home aren't necessarily going to come to fruition for a lot of countries. So it will change the way that we operate and work. So just a couple more things that I want to talk about, just being mindful of time, and I want to make sure that you can all have the opportunity to ask questions. So implementation. So obviously very important once you've designed your BCP strategy, implement it, getting right? So one of the most important things around BCP is test it all the time, make sure it works, right? So, you know, even if you look at something like COVID-19, right, something around call trees. For those of you who don't know what call trees are, if you've worked in a large organization, you'll generally know how they work. It's basically a cascading procedure to notify employees of an emergency. A lot of this came out after you saw the Fukushima nuclear reactor meltdown in Japan. It basically cut a lot of power lines and telecommunications because of the earthquake. So many employees couldn't be contacted. So having a call tree as a cascading mechanism to reach out to employees is very important. A lot of this now, there is technology to automate it, right? So you can get auto dial, auto text messages and so on, notifying you or asking you to notify that you're all right. But usually these are used in the context of you know, emergencies and disasters. But I think with the outbreak of the coronavirus, you're seeing overall, we just think communication and training protocols are in urgent need of development, especially for a lot of SMEs and startups. Large corporates, and I'm from the banks, are usually, I would call them among best in class at BCP. Many other industries, not so much. So I think there's a lot of catch up to be done. It's not a hard process. It just needs to be thought through very well. And the impacts of getting it wrong, as we outlined before, are quite disastrous, okay? So just moving on then for, I guess, one of the important things to look at is what makes for a good BCP strategy. The final element I was really talking about, beyond your governance, beyond your design, beyond your implementation and so on, is culture, right? Culture is a very, very important part of how BCP works. And I think when you look at culture, there's so many elements that can go into it around tone from the top, around your incentive structures, communication, governance, and many, many factors that feed into those overarching umbrella criteria. But I think when it comes to BCP, three real you know, core drivers of culture. So communication and ownership, right? It's not accountability necessarily, it's ownership, right? So is there, as Claude mentioned, a robust external communication and internal communication plan that signals clear ownership, usually from the top? If that's done properly and well, then fantastic, right? I think one of the examples we drew in our, you know, attention to in our report was around the BP Mexican oil spill in 2010, where the then CEO was saying, it wasn't our drill, it wasn't our fault, it wasn't our this, it wasn't our equipment, it wasn't our that. As a result of this, the complete lack of ownership just meant that BP was in the most hectic PR nightmare shitstorm after that, because a lot of the time, you know, people make mistakes, companies make mistakes. If you fall on your sword and you apologize and you move forward in the right way, or there's some kind of ownership around it, then people tend to respond quite favorably. I think it's like that whole thing with Elon Musk bringing his new Tesla truck out and having a laugh on stage when the glass kept breaking, right? It's not one of these things where you devolve blame to everyone else. Obviously, it's a unique kind of an example, but ownership, especially among leadership, is very important for instituting good BCP protocol. Devolvement of power, also very important. Devolvement of power, meaning can someone else in the organization, when you are uncontactable, when you are not available, you might be sleeping, you might be doing something else, can someone else within the organization have the authority to act and make that decision? We gave an example in our report in Hong Kong looking at a restaurant patron who was wearing one of those wristbands which said you should be in a home quarantine, who actually went to a restaurant and was filmed by another patron of the restaurant saying you shouldn't be here, you obviously should be in home quarantine. And instead of that staff member who was serving that customer actively refusing service or asking that customer to leave, that made social media, it made the press, then that restaurant had to shut down, it had to disinfect, it had to do a whole raft of measures, which basically was a disaster, because had they had the foresight or knew they had the power to be able to do that, then they wouldn't be in this situation, right? It's this whole, can I speak to my manager? I don't know what to do. There has to be a process where you can devolve power to people around particular parts of your BCP where they can make decisions that are right and in the interests of the organization. And then finally is the velocity of response. So is the organization open to adopting best practice, being a team player, right? So I think what you saw is the early outbreak of COVID in Hong Kong. You saw hotels do temperature checks and so on. And what happens is that practice started to evolve to companies. So, you saw a best practice spread around the region and across different industries. And not only has that spread across Asia, many of these practices have gone global. I know for our clients, if we need to go in their office, it's the temperature check on the head, it's the declaration form. So a lot of practices that are being transposed from one industry to another in terms of, are we prepared to evolve and make sure that the way we're doing things is correct. Before we go on, Matthew, I know I had this slide placeholder here and I brought you in earlier. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on in the future of work before I go on to the final slide? You're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, I'm back.
Yep.
Yeah, I had a bunch of things to talk about. I know we're short on time, but
yep.
Yeah, I'd just like to, I guess, reiterate some of the themes that have already been discussed here. I think that accountability and ownership, clear responsibility are absolutely integral. I just posted some comments there around culture, building on what you were saying about culture. Your focus was very much around internal cultural factors, but I'd like to also add, Arc Spaces runs a company with 250 employees across the region in 6 cities. So Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Yangon, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore. And we saw as COVID unfolded, starting in China, obviously, that the response needed to take into account local cultural norms as well. So, for example, the demand for things like masks at a very practical level was huge and was the single greatest factor that could potentially disrupt our business. And we had like a Black Railroad shunting masks from our Malaysia team to our China team, for example. And in Malaysia, the relatively slow adoption of government regulation as opposed to in Hong Kong where things happen immediately. So I think from a cultural point of view, that's important. We were very lucky in that we got to learn from the crisis as it evolved through different centers in different markets. But on a very practical level, we found that clear communication and rapid response was vital in looking after our customers and also our teams. And those risk factors that you mentioned, as we saw COVID really rolling out in these different markets for ourselves and for our customers, obviously whose businesses rely on our business continuity planning, that we looked at those key risk factors were our staff, our customers, technology, operations, sales and marketing, and supply chain. And the last one was legal. And I think that's an important point too that we should touch on here, is that from a legal point of view, many companies are now locked into long-term leases and obligations. And I know for certain that we will see increased attention to the wording of force majeure clauses in all contracts moving forward. And that would be a piece of advice from my level of expertise that I would advise for everybody to take into consideration, because you can have a great clause, but it doesn't mean you're going to get out of a contract. And I know, pharma and FMCG industries now are really suffering from that, where they have obligations to deliver and heretofore haven't had protection from any overarching government legislation. So certainly looking at legal clauses around rights with regards to force majeure. I think too, it's an interesting proposal for companies in the new normal to look at the role of flexible workplace as part of their overall BCP, particularly their recovery, and how they might look to disperse mission critical teams into multiple locations to enable business to continue and to still be compliant with government regulations. They have here in Singapore now, it's only the first week of the circuit breaker, and apparently there are police knocking on people's doors to check that they're not socializing. So yeah, having a backup plan and knowing how you will disperse your mission critical teams to enable ongoing operation is vital. And companies like ours, like Arc Spaces, certainly play a key role in working out what those solutions will look like, and also in supporting case by case businesses' requirements as they do recover. In terms of being able to outsource things like sanitization, security, technology, remote servers, etc. And I'm really excited for our industry that I think this will drive innovation and will force us to really look at how we can combine technology with remote working, to support BCP and the recovery of all industries in the wake of COVID-19. That's about it from me.
Am I back on? You guys can hear? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess we can wrap it up with some quick tips for businesses, right? So for those of you who aren't going to go and roll out a full BCP and hire Quinlan Associates to solve all your BCP problems, we've just outlined some very quick tips for most businesses in the current environment, whether you're a large business, a small business, short of developing an actual full BCP strategy. So overall, first priority is basically mitigating the infection risk, right? So some of our suggestions are obviously the whole work from home arrangement wherever possible. Obviously, some things are a bit harder to do and sometimes it's not practical. So if you are required to go to the office, institute daily staff temperature checks. A thermometer is obviously very easy to get. Wash your hands frequently with soap, right? Encourage staff to wear face masks and use hand sanitizer. We do that in our office. If people need to come, we provide the sanitizer, we provide face masks. I'll tell you what, there have been so many debates on whether face masks work. If I look at demographic studies around the world, even Western cities, and you look at the Chinese diaspora, a lot of those areas, the infection rates are very low. I don't want to go into the whole debate around face masks, but you can obviously see there's a change in track of the way that governments are starting to talk about it and the way the WHO is obviously approaching it as well. Disinfect the office regularly, limit in-person meeting sizes. Try not to meet up with 50 people at the same time, right? Keep your distance, have your meetings. And then also this whole comment that I mentioned before is the rotation into fixed teams, right? So 50% on one day, 50% off the other. You can ring fence some of the risks should you obviously face the unfortunate situation that one of your staff may contract coronavirus, right? And then I think the other one is just making sure everyone uses their common sense. Stay home and self-isolate if staff are feeling unwell, exhibiting symptoms. Have they recently traveled? Have they been in contact with people who have traveled? Or are they in a building with confirmed COVID-19 cases? And in our firm, there are people who have been or who live in buildings with confirmed COVID-19, 2 of my staff. So on the back of that, they have been asked to work from home for the next 2 weeks, obviously staying safe. So let's mitigate infection risk, number one. Secondly, especially for small business, control your costs, right? If your revenues aren't coming in, the first priority in an environment like this is to reduce your costs. And I think this is a multi-stakeholder approach, right? So a lot of what Matt said, and again, yes, the whole force majeure clauses or what you could do in this regard, there's variables that depend on your strength as a negotiator and the reasonableness of the counterparty in terms of what you want to discuss. But this could be renegotiating rents with your landlord, particularly in Hong Kong, where that constitutes such a big part of your rent. I know there are some deals going on at the moment, and I know myself and some of our clients have secured rental reductions for our premises, right? Unpaid leave or part-time work. Tricky subject. I'm not going to sit there and say go for it. I don't think you should unanimously shove this down your employees' throats. I don't think that's contractually legal as well. If you want to get into this area where employees actually want to use this time to take time off, spend more time with the family, rotate on part-time, or take unpaid leave, and you can discuss it as a team or a pay reduction, then discuss that openly, but do it as a bilateral discussion. Try and work out a way that you can reduce labor capacity and obviously save on costs, and do it in a way that's, protects the, I guess, well-being of your staff and overall the longevity of your firm. The more specialized your functions are, as I mentioned, like my staff are very important to me. There's a lot of training and skills that go into it, so I have no interest to let any of my staff go. But I imagine certain businesses that are working in very manual labor-intensive functions might consider the staff more easy to replace. So it could be more of a challenge for industries like restaurants, bars, and so on. Cut all the fringe and luxury expenses, right? It depends how you define it, but all the lavish staff perks, meals, client entertainment, not like your clients are wanting to meet up with you at the moment, but in the event that that's happening, just try and be a bit more sensible around it. It can make up a large proportion of budgets in Hong Kong. And then as well, migrate your workflow to online or digital channels. So Zoom, as we're doing now, kind of makes sense wherever you can do it. Pop a conversation online. We're used to it. I think as consultants, we work with clients all around the world, and we often tell clients there's no need for us to travel and see you. If you want to pay for our flights and accommodation, you're more than welcome, or we can just hop on a Zoom and have a normal conversation doing that. So, okay, so that's cost control, right? And then you see the line on the bottom is all about profitability. So protecting revenues, that's the other side. And this is the trickiest side of it when the economy is in what many people consider free fall or recoiling. I think there is still a need to think smart about how you can grow your business, right? So that is speaking to your existing clients about, or even potential clients, about what's your current service or product offering, and find out what their needs are. I mean, the most logical thing, because we do it every day as consultants, is what is your problem? What is the challenge you are facing? I am not going to go and talk about an idea with a client that is not front and center about what they're looking at. And the idea is, how can you help? Now, when it comes to any discussion in sales, I can promise you, for every single person on the phone, it doesn't matter what you do, the conversation needs to evolve to address these new needs. And there's only two ways you really go, right? You're either there to minimize the client pain points or maximize their pleasure. That's it, right? You're either solving a problem that they have, or you're enhancing a potential gain that they may seek to a gain that they may have through engaging your services or buying your product or so on, right? But smarter short-term measures, right? You can adjust your delivery timelines. You can adapt your scope of engagement and what you're going to provide, or your scope of service. Propose new delivery formats, right? I'll deliver this to you virtually. It will be on this particular format. Reprioritize, right? So focus on mission critical. You might be doing a project for 6 months. Maybe the last stage of the project is to work out short-term tactics in the current environment. Don't work that out 6 months later. Work that out right now, right? So reprioritize the things you're going to deliver and make sure you're maximizing value for your end customers as fast as possible. And I think the other ones, especially for startups or smaller businesses on this chat group, it's always a tricky situation, the whole discounting fees or providing alternative payment arrangements. But if your business is dried up, and even if it isn't dried up, I think there is a certain level of empathy that comes with pricing at a level that's commensurate with where the economy is at the moment, right? And you can potentially take staged payments, you can institute milestone fees, so subject to your firm achieving the following targets and so on. Smaller companies, you might take payments in equity, right, if you're servicing a small client. So anyway, the cost control and revenue protection, very important from a profitability perspective. At this point, you obviously need to ensure that your business stays afloat. The government has released a lot of new initiatives regarding subsidies and wage support and other things in both Singapore, Hong Kong, all around the world. So, do your due diligence and investigate what you might be able to secure if you were to follow up with your business and be part of some of these initiatives. Final thing, which is actually very, very important, and then we can hand it over to Q&A if there is the whole maintain productivity and morale. Do not underestimate to the people on this call what social isolation can do to human beings. We are very social creatures. I am about as extrovert as you can get. Locking me up at home is torture to me. It might be an introvert's dream, but I think at the end of the day, many of us do crave social contact and an ability to see friends, colleagues, even the ones we don't like, right? So in an environment where you are working from home, where things are moving digitally, communication's very, very important, and especially with your internal team, right? It isn't just about the regular catch up in the pantry and how's this going. You need to, as you migrate to digital platforms, be much more clear about your guidelines, right? What are your guidelines? What is the delivery expectation, right? You can't talk about FaceTime anymore. You can't talk about this hour to that hour. I want you doing this. That kind of goes out the window. It's what we need done by a certain time. Adapting responsibilities. Certain people, as you realize you move out of an office environment, might be better with certain things like their project management. People who are good at managing teams are now no longer facing their teams. So how do they do that? Responsibilities should evolve, and you should adapt them according to the skills and capabilities of the people within your organization. And it's also very important to communicate your business plans of the company, both short-term tactics and long-term strategy, to your staff. It is quite critical that you do that, because many people will be feeling a lot of anxiety and fear around job security. Some industries more so than others. Some don't even have the luxury because they have lost their jobs already. And to the extent that you can provide people with clarity and assurance, even if it's a negative communication plan, at least the visibility around that is important so people can manage their own expectations accordingly. But I think it's important within those conversations to also remain, quite empathetic and understanding of the fact that people have their own issues, right? That's the kind of last bullet point there. Reach out to discuss personal challenges outside of work. If you think you're going through a difficult time, I can promise you most of the people on this call have been going through their own challenges in the past few weeks. I can guarantee you. And it's really nice to pick up the phone and have a heart-to-heart chat with people, because the psychological impact of isolation, school closures. I know one of my partners is going nuts because her kids are around her all the time. And they're screaming in the phone when we're on Zoom, and they're very cute. They don't have the best ideas for strategy because they're 3 and 1 respectively. But still, we can laugh off that kind of situation, and obviously we're all in this together, right? And to that extent, do some fun stuff. For those of you who don't know, I'm a comedian, right? I love to make people laugh. That is what I do. I love the team to have a laugh. I love us all to be engaging and sharing funny things. This is going to go down in history as one of the best era for memes. I can assure you of that. And the WhatsApp chat groups are genuinely quite hilarious. So I think from that perspective, keep the livelihood up, keep the positive attitude up, keep the good spirits there, because we all need it at this time. And the more you share that around, the more that will come back and ultimately lift you up at the end of the day. So anyway, some quick tips, obviously, for all businesses of any shape and size, and just some early measures that you can take at this point. I'm sure many of you are doing this, but for those of you who aren't, hopefully some useful things in here that you can look at, all right? So that brings us to Q&A. If anyone wants to ask questions, feel free, because I think the chat group is no longer 100, but feel free to, you can speak via your microphone if you would like, or you can type in your questions on the chat function. If you want to have a look at the full report, for anyone struggling to sleep at night that needs something to put them to bed, the full report can be downloaded on our company website at QuinlanAssociates.com. .com. That's going to go down in history on the Insights page. Email info@QuinlanAssociates if you want to reach out with questions. But we have some chats here. What do we have? So, kids and husband at home 24/7 could be tough. Yes, actually, there was an article released, I think, by Bloomberg showing as China came out of lockdown, the divorce rates or applications for divorce were going through the roof. So, I hope you are not going through similar problems, but yes, spending 24 hours a day with anyone can be quite difficult. Where are we? We've got one from Dan. One can of worms is how to ensure staff have employee compensation insurance coverage in this environment, how to determine if work from home staff are truly engaged in activity should there be an incident. Writing this is giving me a headache. Any thoughts? Yeah, well, look, I think in that perspective, Dan, it's quite hard to police what you're doing with your staff. I think, you know, as a boss, I hate micromanaging my employees. That's not what I like to do. And, you know, a lot of the time, I remember when this first started, I can guarantee you I was having my reservations about whether people were doing the Hang Seng Bank intern thing and going on hikes during a day and taking photos and going to end up in the South China Morning Post as the next news story. But that goes back to the most important thing around clear guidelines, deliverables, and just changing the nature of the face-to-face interaction to set targets, right, and responsibilities and changes of roles and what people ultimately need to do. So that is very, very important. But yes, it does definitely give you a headache in terms of engaged at work. But that's why I often pick up the phone and call all of my staff pretty much every day to say hello. They probably get annoyed by me now and just say, leave me alone. But at least I touch base and see how they are.
Maybe
One
I can
from
step
Gap.
in a little bit here on the thing.
Sure.
So if it is a tech company, usually you have alerts and you can define response time, or to a client. It can be a sales responding to a client. And okay, insurance can cover usually the managers, the founders, but you might want to define OKR on your personnel, for your personnel, to respond to these things, so they don't become aggraved incidents. So replying to clients within 4 hours, and then you keep track of these metrics. So it's a little bit more work for the managers, but it's going to incentivize. And after that, you're going to review your employees on the salary and potentially bonus in a couple of months' time. You want to see how well they perform. So if you have been tracking on these OKR, it makes it a little bit easier to measure and say good, not good, you were a bit slow. And you will have comparables as well if you have different employees doing the same thing. Sales, you say one guy is usually responding within 30 minutes, even at midnight, and the other one is always 5 hours. You can try to put expectations on these as well.
Yeah, we've adopted OKRs in response to, well, as part of our ongoing BCP strategies as well. I mean, in that you can sort of align and cascade goals, and you can really build a sense of ownership within teams and within individuals, which is incredibly valuable. We've also adopted the MS 365 suite, which has some amazing analytical software which you can use when through like files being shared on a cloud server like SharePoint, that I can go through there and get a report out which shows me exactly how much screen time everybody is putting in and what's being done. And I guess that's a pretty good litmus test for remote workers' productivity. But yeah, OKRs are a great tool.
Indeed, indeed. Gavin, it's morbid. When should a manager nominate a designated survivor upon positive test, pre-ambulance or pre-ventilator? Let's hope we don't get to that stage, Gavin. Thank you.
How good a staff member is he? I don't know.
Well, as I was saying, my staff are quite funny. They're sending me pictures of this, obviously, while we're on the call, and the partner just messaged me and said, fact check, please, my kids are 3 and 1, not 2 and 5. So clearly I need to be spending more time calling my team. But anyway, I don't know if there is any more questions. I guess we can leave it another 10 seconds if there are, but if not, I just want to thank very much Matthew and Claude for sharing their views today. It's really important in these engagements that it's not a monologue. And, you know, we obviously are talking about our report and there's things that we want to share. But I think when you get the direct real life experience from people in different industries, particularly around future of work, co-working, when you get the whole perspective on digital BCP effectiveness from Claude, I mean, he's been there, he's built it, he's done it. So it's all very, very relevant. And it touches on every single business that we're involved in. From myself personally, you know, I hope to be doing more of these in future. So do keep your eyes out. We will be sharing more insights and webinars. I mean, this seems to be the way forward in terms of the way that we're going to work over the next few weeks, at least. So, but at least for the purposes of this presentation, thank you very much for listening in. I know it's been a fairly long chat. I hope you found it informative and useful. Again, if you want to go and download the report, you can do on the company website, and feel free to email us at info@quinlanassociates.com if you have questions that you want to ask or any follow-up regarding what we can do around BCP. Okay. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much for participating. I wish you all a very happy Easter and a long weekend, although it's exactly the same as every other day. And I hope you get some downtime and get to spend even more time with your families. So thank you very much once again. Stay safe, everyone, and look forward to touching base soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lord. See you soon.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.